exciting stuff with us.
Thanks for the invitation. I'm happy to close it off here. So yeah, Francisco, like Francisco said, I'm a researcher at the National Oceanography Center in the UK. I will probably not take the full 45 minutes because I'm sure you guys probably look forward to wrapping up. But I'm going to talk about a number of different topics that all sort of relate to probability distributions that sort of crop up in the Earth system and how we might think about them, why they might be useful. And this is work that I've done with a number of different people. Phil Goodwin, David Cael, Ali Mashai, Chris Follett, Kelsey Bisson, and a whole number who are all over the place. And these are just some different shapes that we'll cover here. So I'll talk sort of a bit of probability distributions in general, and then I'll give some sort of simple example cases, which I think are things a lot of people will be familiar with, like power laws and log normal distributions. And then we'll kind of get into increasingly complicated stuff. And then I'll close with something that's, I would say, comically complicated, but still useful. So yeah, what's a probability distribution? So, in ocean science, earth science, we typically are looking at the relationship between multiple variables, or, between two variables or many. But oftentimes, we're also interested in variation in a particular variable, or in particular, we want to know a number, and maybe we want to know the uncertainty on that number. And probability distributions can be used in a multivariate case, but we'll just be talking about the univariate case here, where we sort of say, we have a variable and we are describing its variation or its variability, whether we think that is randomness or uncertainty or something else. So in general, a probability distribution is a mathematical tool that we have to use that. And you can sort of think about it like the relative likelihood that a random number takes a particular value. So when we have the normal distribution, I'm not going to be able to point here. So, the likelihood of falling in between two particular values is the sort of integral of that probability distribution. And then, if the actual PDF plot sort of is the relative likelihood that you would, if you grab a random number, that it's going to take on a close, a number close to whatever the PDF is at a particular value. And they have shapes like this, and, they have various properties like they have to integrate to one. So this all sounds very abstract and mathematical, but the reason I think this ultimately ends up being really useful is because there are a whole number of different shapes of probability distributions out there that statisticians and probability theorists, proper mathematicians, have been thinking about for a long time. But these different shapes, they emerge because of particular processes. So, there's an underlying generating process that, is why the randomness gets the particular shape that it has. So for instance, we all love the normal distribution. It crops up, it's a basic part of life, really. And things are normally distributed or Gaussian distributed just because when you add a bunch of things up, the sum has a normal distribution. So, you can think about this like I don't know if you know the song, but like the toe bone's connected to the foot bone's connected to the leg bone, the leg bone's connected to the knee bone. So your height is just the sort of sum of all of these bones in your body, which have random variations in them. And that's why people's heights is Gaussian distributed. Or the reason that, test scores are Gaussian distributed is because question 1 has, 5 points, and some people get 3 points, and some people get 1, and some people get 5. And question 2 is worth 5 points, and your total score is the sum of, your scores. And that's why test scores have a Gaussian distribution. So similarly, exponential distributions happen all the time, and that just is, something that happens because a process happens at a constant rate. And so, if I look at a bunch of methane molecules in the atmosphere, then their age is going to be an exponential distribution because their death could happen at any random moment in time. I think humans have a roughly exponential age distribution after a certain, age too, for the same reason. So then we have gamma distributions, and we have, which happen when you have multiple stages to death or something like that. Or you have distributions like a Weibull distribution, where if I, coffee grounds, like when you grind your coffee, the bean sizes are Weibull distributions because that process is, the sizes of things breaking into bits. So, basically this means that if we see that variation follows a particular distribution, then we know what process is generating that variability. So we understand something mechanistic about the thing we're observing just by looking at the variation in it. And so that's cool from a mechanistic standpoint. But the other thing is, knowing the distribution has a lot of practical implications, which is sort of what I'll try to be, talking about today. It becomes a sort of a useful tool to explain or measure or estimate things that we wouldn't be able to otherwise. So before I get into that, one more kind of bit of nerdy math stuff. So how we fit these distributions or how we estimate these distributions is a bit different than, when you do a linear regression or something like that. So there are a number of ways of doing it, but typically we use not the probability distribution function, but the cumulative distribution function. So if, let's say, if X is my variable on the X-axis, and then Y here is the percentage of my values that are smaller than a certain value. So, here this is an example with stuff on a circle, but, basically if this blue value is at 0.2 when, X is 2, that means 20% of my data is less than 2. And the way that we kind of compare a theoretical and an empirical distribution is we look at the maximum mismatches between the two, the empirical and the theoretical distribution in this kind of cumulative space. And the reason for looking at, what this metric V here is this is the maximum difference where one is bigger than the other, plus the maximum difference where the other is bigger than the one. And the reason for doing that is because that actually ends up weighing all of the data equally. Whereas if I were just to look at the maximum, it would weigh towards like my center values a little bit more. But that, that's, I'm happy to answer questions about the details of this, but that's just like a general idea about how we're kind of making this comparison. So one example that all the time in nature are power laws. So these are, these basically look like when you have when you look at the cumulative distribution on a log-log plot, it looks like a straight line. And what that means is basically that there's no scale to the process. So that means that I can kind of think about it as things happening twice, 10 times as large or 100 times as large is just as likely. It doesn't change the probabilities of how things happen. So one really trivial kind of example to help think about this is, let's say I have a grid of boxes here, and I'm gonna fill in boxes with some random probability. So let's say, you could think about this like a chessboard, but instead of having white and black, the probability that a given space is black is some probability. And I'm looking at the kind of sizes of the clusters of black squares that are all next to each other. So it turns out when I rescale here and I just say for each of these quadruplets of boxes, if I have 0 black squares, then I'm a white square. If I have 3 or 4 black squares, I'm a black square. And if I have 2 black squares and 2 white squares, I'm 50% chance a white square and 50% chance a black square. And I kind of jump to a sort of coarser representation of that grid, then I have the exact same type of behavior, and I get the same types of patterns. So that means that the distribution of sizes of those clusters has to be a power law, because I can rescale the process and I get the same exact type of behavior. So it turns out that this power law has a very particular exponent to it, which characterizes sort of the relative likelihood of a cluster of size 10 versus a cluster of size 100 or something. And that exponent happens to be 187 divided by 91, which is 2.054 with some other digits. Don't ask me why, because that's not, it just that happens to be the right answer. So there's this really cool thing that happens in nature, which is if I look at the number of lakes larger than an area. So this is my cumulative distribution function. This is area. I get that same sort of linear shape on a log-log plot with that same exponent out to 4 significant digits. So this is 1.054, but that's because they're looking at, they're doing it in a different way that changes the value by 1. So this is the exact same, distribution with the exact same parameter value out to 4 significant digits. And instead of looking at random stuff on a chessboard that seems like totally abstract and has nothing to do with nature, all of a sudden it becomes an extremely good description of the relative abundance of lakes of different sizes on Earth. And we actually see that this happens not just for lakes, this happens for all kinds of different water bodies. So this is a picture of melt ponds that form on the surface of the Arctic, where you sort of have, the bit of the ice that's sticking above the water. There's some, water that melts on that, and it forms these cool kind of fractal, beautiful pond shapes. And those are important because they change the albedo of the ice surface. And so then they have these kind of melting feedbacks. So those have a power law distribution, and those can be described by a very similar model. And then, we actually, so this was the first paper I ever published. I was really into these melt ponds, and I was at this place in Maine where when the tide would go out on this river, you'd get these kind of funny little puddles all along it. And I was like, oh, that looks like the surface of the Arctic. So we actually went out and we took an iPhone on the end of a fishing pole and we took pictures of the mud ponds. And then we kind of, adjusted so this is in the bottom left here. And those yellow things are actually, that's like a pool noodle that we cut into little slices so that you could have a reference scale size for the, so the size of the ponds in the image. And so then we process the image to get the ponds out, and we get the same kind of power law distribution of sizes for these ponds. And so this is a very, I think, general common process that happens in nature, which is cool. And so that actually, one of the reasons that's practical and useful in a way that maybe seems non-intuitive is that allows us to ask specific questions about particular lakes. So, for instance, there's this really long-standing question about whether the Caspian Sea is a lake or not, because it's an inland water body, but it's like 4 times larger by area than any other lake on Earth. So if you look at the area of the Caspian Sea, its area is, much larger than all 5 of the Great Lakes in the kind of northeast, in the US and Canada. So it's like so much bigger. How could you think of it as a lake? So what you can do is you can take this kind of power law distribution for lake sizes, and you can randomly sample from it a bunch of times, and then you just pick the biggest lake. And then you do that again, and you get the biggest lake. And you do that again, and you get the biggest lake. And so you can imagine it's as if you have 1 million planets that have the same lake size distribution as Earth. They're all going to have, their biggest lake is going to be a slightly different size because, randomness is a factor here. And so we can look at the distribution of the biggest lakes on all these million fake planets. And what you basically see is that the Caspian is only bigger than, 3/4 of these largest lakes. So we can't say with confidence that the Caspian is actually larger than our expectations for the largest lake on Earth. And in fact, it's pretty consistent with our expectations for the size of the largest lake on Earth. Lake Superior is the next largest, and it's sort of smaller than we would expect for the largest lake on Earth. So this is kind of actually pretty spot on. Whereas the ocean is bigger than all 1 million of those, your Earth's largest lakes for the fake planets. And so, that means that the ocean is definitely not a lake by that estimation, because it's way too large. So that brings to bear sort of, you can give a context to this question about, is the Caspian size actually too big to disqualify it from being a lake? So that's one example. Another one that comes up a lot is the log normal distribution. So this is very similar to the Gaussian distribution or the normal distribution, except for instead of adding stuff together, we're multiplying stuff together. And this is another example of a place where, the more complex something is, eventually that can result in it actually ending up being pretty simple in a paradoxical way, because that complexity all kind of smushes its, like, you know, cancels itself out. So we can think about things that are log normally distributed as following something like the law of necessary conditions. So if our children's phrase for the normal distribution was that the toe bone's connected to the foot bone, for here it would be that parable about how, for want of a nail, you know, the war was lost because of the horseshoe and all this other stuff. So basically the idea here is, you know, we have, if you have some process where there are a bunch of steps that all need to happen for that process to happen, and if any one of them doesn't happen, then it won't happen, then that process happens at a log normal rate. So for instance, you know, there was a paper in the 80s where they showed that different lab groups in, you know, different academic and research labs, their publication record, you know, was log normally distributed. And the idea there was that, you know, to publish a paper, you write the funding, get the funding, you know, collect set the experiments up. I don't know, this isn't the kind of work I do, so I don't know, the steps are different for different people, but set the experiments up, you know, do the experiments, collect the data, analyze the data, you know, write the paper up, get it to review, etc. So if any one of those steps doesn't happen, then the paper doesn't get published. And so therefore, if, you know, because you have this kind of law of necessary conditions, where the probability of something happen is the product of the probabilities of each part of it happening. So that's these Q's here. So then, you know, the log of their probability is the sum of the logs of the other probabilities. And therefore, you know, you get a normal distribution for the log, and therefore you get a log normal distribution for the actual variable. So where this might happen in nature is, you know, we've looked at this with ocean carbon fluxes. So, you know, if you think about a little plankton in the ocean, if it's going to fix some carbon at a certain point in time, then it needs there to be light, and it needs there to be not something there to eat it, and there needs to be the right temperature, there needs to be enough nitrogen, there needs to be enough iron, blah, 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 blah. And if any one of those things doesn't happen, then it can't do its job. So by the same logic, productivity measurements should be log normally distributed in the ocean. And then, you know, if we think about the export of that carbon that's produced as, you know, being another necessary product thing where the productivity needs to happen, and then it needs to end up in a particle, and then that needs to sink, and it needs not to be eaten and, or, you know, fragmented or whatever, then that should be log normal. And we see, you know, that over and over again, you see log normal distributions for both of these processes. So this, you know, these green and black plots are plotting these as probability distribution functions and histograms, but you can also plot this in this way in the bottom right-hand corner here, which is just sort of comparing the percentiles of a theoretical distribution to the empirical distribution. And this kind of percentile view is a different way of sort of looking at where in the distribution the mismatches are. And this can help us sort of explain why maybe we see a mismatch in observations between flux and production measurements locally, because, you know, if we think about this as driven by randomness, then it shouldn't be that the individual measurements are related. It should be that the sort of distributions are related on a larger scale. And so we see very robustly in different parts of the ocean, or at different times, or different depths, that we always get log normal distributions for productivity. And similarly, you know, at all kinds of different stations in the ocean, we see log normal variations in carbon fluxes, even all the way down to the seafloor. So that means this kind of log normal variability happens from the productivity all the way to pretty much that carbon being deposited on the sea surface. So it's really like profound, it's ubiquitous description of the variability of these sort of fluxes. And so that means we can kind of use that to look at the relationships between variables whose measurements might not individually be good. So we can do that by comparing the moments of these distributions. And when we do that, we think we see some kind of scaling relationship between these, and that's a sort of different way of characterizing how production and flux are related. But it's more consistent with these sort of the variability in these data. And actually, you can, this sort of mode of, or this type of variability happens, all the way, it's detectable all the way from space, and it goes all the way down to the seafloor. So we see it, even in the remote sensing measurements or not measurements, they're estimates, they're models, but even remote sensing based from satellites productivity has this signature of log normality in it, and that propagates all the way down to the seafloor, which is, I think, very cool. But when it comes to the space measurements, we need to make a slight adjustment, which is that when I make a measurement from space, I'm looking at this huge spatial region, and I'm not just looking at the sort of the local sort of bottle type tiny measurement that I'm getting when I have a productivity measurement in situ. And so I have to account somehow for that. I'm integrating over depth, and I'm integrating this large spatial scale. And what I really am doing then is I'm taking the average of a bunch of log normal variables. And the average of a log normal is not a log normal. It's this other thing, and now we're getting slightly into complicated distribution territory that's called a log skew normal. And so that is a log normal, just like I have plotted here, but it has this extra parameter, which I'm calling theta, which sort of describes how much it's skewed to the left or the right. And so you can, as theta is positive, then you end up with a kind of heavy-tailed distribution where you're pushed, your data tend to sit towards the right, and as theta becomes negative, then you have a low tail, like a small-tailed distribution, and that theta depends on how many different things you're averaging over, how many log normals you're averaging over, and also the correlations between those. And that log skew normal actually arises not just for productivity, but it also arises for turbulence measurements. So this is going from huge, big scale global satellite stuff down to very micro scale, where we drop a profiler in the ocean, and we're looking at the variations in temperature on like centimeter levels. And the reason for this is basically because we in the ocean we have a whole bunch of different processes that generate the turbulence that we observe. And when we're making an observation of a turbulence rate, then we're making an observation that is sort of the sum of all of those different processes all happening at once. And so that measurement is not just the measurement of one process, which has a log normal generating mechanism. It's instead the sum of a bunch of different processes which happen, they have their own different spatial patterns, and they're but they're all occurring and interacting all at once. And so you end up getting a log skew normal because you're sampling the sum of those individual processes. And so this has all kinds of implications in terms of ocean turbulent mixing. This allows us to make better estimates of the efficiency of mixing in the ocean, and then we can make sort of maps of spatial patterns of this mixing that are, I think, pretty different than the sort of, usually oceanographers use a constant value for that mixing efficiency, but by having a mechanistic description of where this variability comes from, then we can use that to characterize mixing efficiency more mechanistically. And that also sort of helps explain why you have a difference in different ways of measuring the mixing rate. So, when we look at it directly from individual measurements, then we're just sort of summing over a finite number of measurements. But the other major way of getting at the sort of diffusivity in the ocean is you drop a tracer in the ocean, and then you look at how it spreads, and you estimate from its spread what the sort of mixing efficiency is, or the diffusivity. And that typically, what you tend to do when you see these experiments is that the tracer-based estimate is much higher than the individual sample-based estimate. And I think this distribution helps explain that, because you have such a massively heavy-tailed distribution here that the contribution to the total mixing by the very, very high tail is massive. So, almost all of your mixing is happening like in a few particular heavy-tailed places. And so when you're just sampling from that distribution, you're going to tend to sample, your average of your samples is going to be smaller the true mean of your distribution, whereas the tracer is seeing the true mean of the distribution. And sort of, you know, so we've been playing around with this. I didn't have time. I was going to make better figures for this plot, but basically it looks like this can help explain the discrepancy in certain experiments and others, you know, ocean cruises where they've compared these metrics, why you see this discrepancy in the diffusivity. So that's one of just two more distributions I want to go over. So one of them is sort of the maximum analog to the normal distribution. So when we're looking at the normal distribution, we're taking a bunch of things and we're adding them up, and then we're looking at the distribution of their sum. But if instead I just was interested in the maximum, what I would do is I would take a bunch of things and I would just look at the largest one and I'd throw the rest away. And I would take a bunch of other things and I would take the largest one and I'd throw the rest away. And I do that a bunch of times. So exactly how we did with the Caspian Sea and those random planets. So I have, you know, a bunch of lakes and I just take the biggest one and I throw the rest away. And I want to look at the variability or the distribution of those maximum values. So in the same way that there's a distribution that characterizes the normal, their sum or their average, which is the normal distribution, there's a distribution that characterizes the maximum, which is called the generalized extreme value distribution. And that distribution has basically one parameter which controls its shape. That parameter is called Xi here. And you sort of see that as a function of Xi that you can, your maxima tend to, when you have a positive Xi, you can have very, very large maxima that are like huge relative to the average, many standard deviations away from your average value. And when Xi is negative, then your maxima tend to look pretty similar to your average value. So for instance, if I'm looking at the tallest person in a bunch of people, then, you know, if my Xi is -0.5, then my tallest person might be 7 feet, 7 foot tall or 2 meters tall or something. Whereas if my Xi is +0.5, the tallest person might be 10 feet tall or 3 meters tall. So it basically characterizes how likely I am to get a very extreme. So what we've done recently is shown that this actually applies to thermal extremes in the paleo record. So on the left here is a plot of more or less temperature over the last 66 million years. So, this is delta 18O, which is an ocean, an isotopic ratio of oxygen. And there's a bunch of details, but you can basically think about it as the higher the delta 18O, the colder the average Earth temperature at that time. And this is a ton of work has gone into just looking at this over the last 66 million years. And you sort of see four things. You see a downward trend, which means the Earth's been cooling. You see a lot of little wiggles around that. You can't see it in this plot, but we've all know about glacial interglacial cycles. So we see that in the last 2.5 million years, we see these kind of cyclic jumps between colder and warmer periods. But we also see in here that we get these really big spikes in temperature where all of a sudden it's boof. And the largest one of them is called the Paleocene thermal maximum, where you see this massive jump in temperature about 55 million years ago. But there are a bunch of spikes in here as well. And so, you can actually show that the sort of distribution of maxima in these over time here is really beautifully described by the GeV. And so that means we have a method to characterize the sort of variability in extreme temperatures over Earth's history. But that's nice in itself, but the reason that that's useful is because that also helps us characterize how changes in the extremes might depend on things like the background climate state. So what we can do is we can look at, the Xi value for that distribution in times when the climate's warm, in times when the climate's kind of cool, in times when the climate's hot, and times when the climate's cold, and and so forth. And what we see is we have this nice monotonic trend between Xi and the kind of background average delta 18O value, which indicates that basically as the climate gets cooler, Xi gets more negative, or vice versa, as the climate gets warmer, C gets more positive. And what this ends up meaning in terms of a difference in the shape is shown in this middle figure. And that sort of shows you that in a background climate state like we have today, where delta 18O is about 4, that we never really see extreme values that are more than 3 standard deviations above the mean. Whereas in a background climate state like the PETM was, when delta 18O is about 0, that we can get extremes in temperature that are more than 3 standard deviations above the extremes. So we can think about this in terms of the sort of extremes by looking at the probability, the relative probability of getting an extreme event that's more than 3 standard deviations above the mean. And what we see is that you sort of, as you warm the Earth, that your relative likelihood of one of these sort of big extreme temperature events happening goes up substantially. So, by the time, if the Earth's 4 degrees warmer than it is today, then we're more than 3 times as likely to get one of these extreme events where, the Earth's temperature jumps a bunch. And so, this obviously has lots of caveats because you're using paleo stuff. I don't mean to make a scary plot about the future, that's unsubstantiated, but it's just sort of a qualitative way of understanding this. And it's, I think it's a nice way of kind of using the paleo data and characterizing it. So then the last one I'll talk about, this is the nasty, ugly distribution. So all of these we've been able to write down with pen and paper so far, but I'm going to use a probability distribution, which, all of these, so this bottom equation is a term that's inside the second to last equation there at the end, which then is a term inside that equation, a first equation, which is, again, kind of, so we have this one's really, really messy to write out. But what basically, what another thing we're interested in is how variations happen in lakes. So I'm sure that you're all familiar with fractal Brownian, or with Brownian motion, where you kind of have a random walk, but you can think about that in a more fractal sense, where you're, the nice thing about Brownian motion is that if I have a kind of Brownian motion trajectory, if I zoom in on it, it's a fractal, so it looks the same as I zoom in. And if I zoom in more, it looks in this, it looks the same. I'm sure you've all seen videos like that. But we can have a more general type of random walk where if I zoom in, it looks the same, but I have to zoom in at different aspect ratios horizontally and vertically. And that's called fractal Brownian motion. And so, these guys recently described this horribly ugly probability distribution, which is for the maximum of a random walk as a function of that sort of aspect ratio, which is characterized by an exponent that's called h. So this also sounds very abstract, but it turns out this is a really beautiful way of describing the maximum depth of lakes. So if I think about my Earth's surface as this kind of fractal Brownian motion, it turns out that Earth topography is really well described as a Brownian path with an h value of about 0.4. So I can think about my lake as just a bit of water that's sort of sitting on one of these paths. And then in that case, my area of my lake would be something like the square root of the sort of length of that transect there. And the maximum depth would be just set by the maximum, the minimum attained by this path over that transect, which means that I can use this horribly ugly probability distribution to characterize my distribution of maximum depths, where I have to also account for the fact that lakes have different areas. And it turns out that this again describes, lake maximum depth distributions using this sort of fixed h of 0.4 super well, which is great. Mostly, not just because we want to understand why lakes have their maximum depths that they do, but because we actually can't go out and measure the depths of all of the lakes on Earth because there are way too many of them. So what we want to do instead is sort of say, well, if I have a ton of lakes, how can I describe and I want to understand some bulk property of those lakes that depends on their maximum depths. I don't have the money to go and make all those measurements, which would also be really boring. But what I can do instead is think about a description of their depths that allows me to get to the right answer, even if I haven't measured them. And so one way that this is useful is doing that. And so, for an example, one property that's really important for where maximum depth is really important for lakes is how much methane they emit. And you can see in these plots, this is just some empirical data that shows that actually the maximum depth is much more important than the area or the size of the lake in terms of its methane flux. And so what we can do here is we can't go measure the maximum depth of all the lakes on Earth, but we can look at the areas of all of them and then make estimates of their, random estimates of their maximum depths. And we can get an estimate there of all of the total sort of methane flux out of all the lakes on Earth. And when you do that, you get, about 26 teragrams of carbon a year, which is sort of a good ballpark estimate that's consistent with very different ways of doing this. So yeah, that's the sort of last example I wanted to give. I just wanted to sort of say that probability distributions are a useful way to both explain variability in data, because different processes are associated with different shapes, but also that they collapse information into a few key parameters, so they can help with all kinds of things like undersampling or relating or parameterizing processes, and that we have sort of statistical methods for doing this. So from that, I'll close and I'll take questions.